The call reached the Larchmere police desk at 1:41 in the morning, when the Christmas candles at St. Audrey's were still burning low in their brass sockets, and the last cars from midnight mass had already slid away down the limestone hill. The woman on the line was Miriam Dace, the parish records custodian, a narrow, gray-haired woman known in town for remembering baptism dates better than birthdays, and for correcting misspelled names on funeral cards with a fountain pen she kept clipped to her cardigan. Her voice did not begin with a scream. It began with the careful breath of someone trying not to lose control. She said that Father Adrian Loxley was gone. She said he had stepped out after Mass to answer a private emergency, that his coat was missing from the sacristy hook, that the north garden gate was open, and that a man who had been threatening him over his wife's burial plot had been seen near the cemetery wall. By the time Detective Ada Stellan arrived, the church looked less like the center of a holy night than a building surprised by violence and trying not to admit it. The sanctuary smelled of beeswax, incense, damp wool, and the sour residue of extinguished matches. Poinsettias lined the communion rail in red banks. A wicker basket of hymn leaflets had tipped beside the side aisle. In the sacristy, Father Adrian's white vestment was folded over a wooden chair with the precision of a man who expected to come back for it. His missal lay open on the table beside a chalice veil. His black shoes were still on his feet when people last saw him, but his winter coat, scarf, and old leather satchel were missing. Miriam stood beside the metal cabinet where the sacramental registers were kept, her hands wrapped in a dish towel, as if she had been interrupted while putting away cups. She had blotches of color high on her cheeks, and whenever she answered a question, she looked toward the open garden door. She told the first story plainly. After the final blessing, Father Adrian had remained by the center aisle, shaking hands, listening to children explain what gifts they hoped would come by morning, greeting a widower named Fergus Taine, who stood in the rear under the statue of St. Michael, but would not step forward. Fergus had lost his wife that autumn and had blamed Father Adrian for refusing to change the parish cemetery ledger to place her in a family plot whose rights had expired decades earlier. There had been letters. There had been an ugly exchange in the parish office. Miriam said she had heard Fergus say, not loudly, but with enough venom to chill her, "You stole my last place with her." She said Father Adrian looked stricken rather than afraid. After Mass, Miriam continued, Father Adrian came into the record room to return the Christmas register because he was fussy about records even at 2 in the morning. The office phone rang once. Miriam did not answer it because she was stacking collection envelopes. Father Adrian answered from the wall phone near the safe, listened, and told her that someone was in trouble by the cemetery gate. He told her to lock the records, say nothing to the altar boys, and wait for him if he was not back in 10 minutes. When 10 minutes became 20, she opened the garden door and found a smear in the frost on the flagstones. "Not blood," she said quickly. "Just wet dirt. A dragged heel, maybe nothing." The north gate was swinging. Beyond it lay the cemetery lane, the old receiving chapel, the shuttered parish school, and, 2 blocks farther on, the rows of boarded hosiery mills where men slept in the delivery bays when the shelters filled. The first hours obeyed her story because her story seemed built from things everyone already knew. Fergus Taine was volatile and lonely. Father Adrian was the kind of priest who answered calls without calculating the danger. The cemetery gate did swing in the wind. One patrol officer found a pair of glove marks on the frozen iron latch. Another found Fergus's truck 3 streets away, parked crookedly outside an all-night laundromat, though Fergus himself was not inside. By dawn, searchers had moved through the cemetery rows with flashlights, past stones glazed white with ice fog, past evergreen wreaths wired to metal stands, calling Father Adrian's name in the flat, embarrassed way people call for someone they fear will not answer. The town woke to patrol lights in the church parking lot, and to the rumor that the priest had gone out to help a desperate man and had not returned. Fergus was found at 7:20 that morning behind the boiler plant of the old hosiery warehouse, asleep or passed out beneath a packing blanket. He smelled of stale beer and machine oil. He had Father Adrian's parish bulletin folded in his coat pocket and dirt on his knees. When Detective Stellan asked him where he had been between midnight and 2, Fergus started crying before he understood that crying made him look guilty. He said he had gone to Mass because his wife used to go every Christmas, but he could not stand the music and left before communion. He admitted he had shouted at Father Adrian earlier in December. He admitted he had written letters. He denied making any call. He denied meeting the priest by the cemetery wall. His grief came out in a rage so familiar to the officers that it seemed to confirm everything Miriam had said. He slammed his cuffed hands against the table and demanded to know whether they had even looked inside the receiving chapel, whether they had checked the mill-loading bays, whether they understood that the priest had promised to set things right and then avoided him. In the transcript, his questions read like concern. In the room, they sounded like a man trying to control the search. For 3 days, the search stayed close to the version Miriam had given. Divers were not needed because there was no river near St. Audrins, no lake, no quarry, water, only alleys, stone yards, drainage culverts, the old cemetery, the shuttered school, and blocks of textile buildings with windows patched in tin. Volunteers moved through boiler rooms with paper masks. Police dogs nosed along fences dusted with frost. The receiving chapel was opened by the cemetery caretaker and shown to be empty except for 2 cracked wooden biers, a stack of green burial tents, 3 folding chairs, and a zinc-lined table left from the years when winter burials had to wait for softer ground. The search log recorded it as cleared. No one questioned the word because the caretaker had the key. 2 officers stood at the door, and nothing in the narrow stone room looked capable of hiding a man. Father Adrian's parishioners filled the church every evening that week. Miriam sat in the front pew with a clipboard on her lap, taking down volunteer names, organizing meals, correcting rumors. She gave televised interviews only when the diocesan spokesman asked her to, and even then, she looked at the floor more than at the camera. She described the priest as patient, overworked, private, and brave in a way that made it difficult for anyone to imagine she knew more than she said. She remembered that he had once walked 2 miles in sleet to anoint a man no ambulance could reach. She remembered that he kept peppermints in the top drawer for children. She remembered that he could not pass a crooked altar candle without straightening it. When the reporter asked whether he had enemies, Miriam paused and said that grief made enemies of people who were not truly enemies. The answer sounded merciful. It also turned Fergus Taine into exactly the kind of suspect people could discuss without feeling cruel. The official case did not collapse. It simply failed to become complete. Father Adrian's satchel was never found. His phone stopped connecting at 1:18 a.m., just after Mass ended, and the tower coverage around St. Audrins was too blunt to prove movement. The church had no useful cameras. The old exterior camera over the parish hall door had been dead since Thanksgiving, a fact entered into the maintenance book in Miriam's handwriting. No neighbor saw Father Adrian leave the rectory garden, but the night was cold and late, and the houses along the hill had drawn curtains. Fergus's boots could not be matched to the marks near the gate. The smear Miriam had noticed proved to be ordinary mud and melted frost. A partial print on the garden latch belonged to half the parish because the gate was used every Sunday by choir members, catechism teachers, florists, and boys cutting through to the schoolyard. The case remained a shape without a center. Detective Stellan disliked shapes without centers. She disliked Fergus as a suspect, not because he seemed harmless, but because he seemed too loudly guilty in all the wrong ways. He talked when he should have stayed silent. He had real anger and no plan. He had no car movement after midnight. The truck near the laundromat had been there long enough for ice to form evenly on the windshield. His phone, cheap and cracked, had not placed the call Miriam described. The payphone near the mills had been removed 3 years earlier. Still, there were enough loose ends to keep him under suspicion. He had threatened a priest. The priest had vanished. The town did the rest. By February, the search posters had softened in the rain and hardened again in the cold until Father Adrian's face looked slightly warped behind the plastic sleeves. The diocese appointed a temporary administrator who commuted from another parish and never learned where the paper cups were kept. Miriam remained indispensable. She opened the office, answered calls from parishioners who cried on the line, tracked candle donations, kept the funeral schedule from becoming chaos, and met weekly with Detective Stellan or Detective Royce Mabin when there was nothing new to say. She never rushed those meetings. She brought notes. She corrected dates. She did not ask whether Fergus had confessed, but when his name came up, she lowered her eyes, as if praying for both men. If she was performing, Ada could not find the seam. Father Adrian's private life appeared, at first, to be small. His rectory bedroom held a narrow bed, 2 black suits, 4 clerical shirts, wool socks folded like military cloth, theological books with clean margins, and a shoebox of Christmas cards kept by year. There were no bottles, no hidden cash, no romantic photographs, no letters tied with ribbon. His desk contained homily drafts, hospital schedules, counseling notes too general to violate any confidence, and a list of repairs needed before the January freeze. He had been pastor of St. Audran's for 9 years. Before that, he had served at smaller parishes, a prison chapel, and a diocesan tribunal office. He was respected, though not adored. He had the gravity of a man who had learned not to make himself easy to know. People said he listened more than he spoke. In a missing person case, that kind of virtue becomes a wall. The first sign that the wall had a door did not arrive from a witness, a camera, a confession, or a dramatic object found in a field. It arrived in June, in a room above the parish hall that smelled of dust, copy toner, and old carpet glue. St. Audran's was being merged with 2 smaller parishes into a new administrative district, and the diocese had sent a contract archivist named Rosalind Kerr to reconcile the sacramental records before the files were moved. Rosalind was not local. She did not know Fergus Taine's face or Miriam's reputation or Father Adrian's habits. She knew paper, ink, registers, duplicate certificates, and the tiny evasions by which institutions lost things while claiming to preserve them. On her 3rd day, she found a gray archival box behind 2 outdated First Communion banners. The box had no proper label, only a strip of masking tape reading, "Pastoral Household Cards, Do Not Index," in handwriting that did not match the official record labels. Inside were 26 cream-colored cards, each the size of an envelope, each containing cross-references to baptismal certificates, emergency blessing notes, tuition receipts, and private pastoral visits. Most involved ordinary cases. A homebound parishioner who had received sacraments when the roads were closed, a child baptized before adoption paperwork was complete, a marriage convalidation delayed by a missing civil license. But 4 cards were different. They carried the surname March, Willa March, Pippa Rose March, Miles Adrian March. Beside the children's baptism entries, someone had typed the father's civil name, not a clerical title. Adrian James Loxley. Then, with a blade or an eraser, someone had scraped the line almost clean, leaving the letters visible only when Rosalind tilted the paper under the desk lamp. On the reverse of one card was a note in Father Adrian's tight script. Family record to be regularized after Christmas. Original truth must not remain hidden in mercy files. Rosalind did not know what the sentence meant, but she knew enough to stop touching the cards with bare fingers. She called the diocesan chancellor, who called the police, and by late afternoon, Detective Stellan stood over the archive table, while dust motes drifted in the heat, and Miriam Dace waited downstairs in the parish office, unaware that the case had changed floors. The cards were not proof of a crime. They were proof that Father Adrian had possessed a secret large enough to alter the meaning of every silence around him. They also proved that the parish records, the one part of St. Audryn's Miriam understood better than anyone alive, had concealed a family under a category vague enough to sound charitable. Willa March lived 90 miles away in Kestrel Flats, a town of low apartment blocks, bus garages, and discount furniture stores at the edge of the inland highway. Her building had a courtyard with 2 struggling plane trees and a mailroom light that flickered even in daylight. When Ada and Royce knocked, Willa opened the door with the look of someone who had rehearsed fear for years and still had not mastered it. She was 44, dark-haired, thin from work and worry, wearing a supermarket uniform under a blue cardigan. Behind her, a girl of 16 stood in the kitchen doorway with the same careful eyes as Father Adrian, and a boy of 11 sat at the table with homework open, but untouched. Willa did not deny his name. She did not ask whether he was alive. She closed her eyes once, held the edge of the doorframe, and said, "I told him secrecy would bury one of us." The story she gave them was not clean enough to satisfy anyone who wanted a saint or a villain. She had met Adrian before he was ordained, when he was still a seminarian on leave after his father died, and she was working at a church retreat center. Pippa had been born before ordination, though almost no one knew. Adrian returned to seminary believing, or persuading himself, that he could serve God, support Willa, love his daughter quietly, and never force the church or the child to bear the scandal of his failure. Years later, Miles was born during a period when Adrian was supposed to be deciding whether to leave ministry. Willa described it without ornament, with the exhausted honesty of someone who had lived inside other people's categories and found none of them large enough. He had not abandoned them. He had not belonged to them openly. He visited, paid rent when he could, read homework over video calls, remembered dental appointments, and sent birthday cards signed A. He was loved and resented in the same rooms. Father Adrian had planned to leave St. Audryn's after Christmas. Willa showed the detectives a folder hidden behind cookbooks. It held copies of letters he had drafted to the bishop, a petition for laicization he had not yet filed, a list of insurance questions, and printouts from the parish bookkeeping system with amounts circled in red. There were also photocopies of ledger pages from St. Audryn's Mercy Fund, Cemetery Assistance Fund, Candle Account, and Emergency Burial Charity. At the top of one page, Father Adrian had written, "MD controls disbursement batch and original register, must secure before disclosure." Willa said he had been frightened in the last month, not of Fergus Taine, whose name meant nothing to her, but of Miriam. He had told Willa that Miriam discovered the children years earlier when a certificate request came through the diocesan office, and that she had protected the secret at first. Protection had become leverage. Leverage had become habit. On Christmas Eve, Willa said, he called at 11:06 p.m. before midnight mass. The children were already half asleep, pretending not to be, because he had promised to come after the church was empty and drive them to a diner off the highway for pancakes, like he did on years when he could escape. He sounded tired and strangely relieved. He said he had put copies where they needed to go, that after Mass he would retrieve one more register, speak to Miriam, and then leave. Willa asked him not to confront anyone alone. He answered with the kind of tenderness that had made her stay too long inside a life without public name. "No more halfway doors," he said. At 1:29 a.m., his private number called again. Willa answered on the first ring. There was breathing, a scrape, then a woman's voice in the distance saying, "You don't get to wash yourself clean with my ruin." The call ended after 8 seconds. Willa tried again 12 times. The phone was dead. The 8-second call had not appeared in the original police extraction because no one knew the private number existed. Father Adrian's parish phone and official mobile were both accounted for. The private phone, the one Willa called the family phone, was missing with him. Her carrier records confirmed the call time and placed the device near St. Audrins. That single detail did more damage to Miriam's story than any accusation could have done. Miriam had said Father Adrian vanished around 1:05 after answering an office call and walking out the garden gate. But at 1:29, his private phone was still active near the church, and Willa heard a woman's voice using language that sounded nothing like Fergus Tane begging about a grave. Ada did not confront Miriam immediately. The first rule of a reoriented case was to let the old story continue talking before it realized anyone had stopped believing it. The detectives returned to St. Audrins with warrants narrower than their suspicions. They took the gray archival box, the original sacramental registers, the cemetery ledger, the Mercy Fund disbursement files, the key log for the record vault, and the paper visitor calendar that Miriam had maintained with near-religious neatness. They took the office phone records, though the system was old and its memory thin. They took Miriam's fountain pen from her desk, over her quiet objection that it had belonged to her mother. They swabbed the metal record cabinet handles. They photographed the floorboards in the record room, the garden door, the steps to the cemetery lane, and the inside of the small storage alcove where the folding chairs were kept. Miriam watched from behind the reception counter with the expression of a woman enduring necessary indignity for the sake of a man she had loved as a pastor. When Ada asked whether Father Adrian had any private family connections, Miriam blinked slowly, then said, "Priests often became family to lonely people." When Ada placed the name Willa March in front of her, Miriam did not ask who that was. That was the first mistake. She looked down at the name with recognition already in her face, then covered it with confusion half a second too late. She said she had processed many pastoral hardship files and could not recall every household. She said Father Adrian sometimes bent rules for people he pitied. She said, in a tone of injured discretion, that if a priest had sinned, it did not mean someone had harmed him. She used the word sin before any detective did. The records told their own slower version. Father Adrian had not been careless. He had been divided. He had kept duplicate cards for Willa and the children because he wanted them to exist somewhere official, but he kept them outside the indexed registers because public discovery would shatter all 4 lives. Miriam had known. Her handwriting appeared on mailing envelopes sent to Willa's building under the bland category Household Pastoral Assistance. Her initials appeared beside tuition payments, disguised as emergency rent grants. At first, those payments seemed to implicate Father Adrian in misuse of parish funds, but Royce noticed that the amounts sent to Willa were small, regular, and often reimbursed by money orders deposited 2 days later from Father Adrian's personal account. The larger irregularities clustered elsewhere: funeral assistance checks to names that did not match any death certificates, candle supply invoices billed twice, cemetery plot refunds issued to post office boxes, and winter vault handling fees paid to a maintenance company that had dissolved before the invoices were written. The dissolved company had belonged to Hugo Dace, Miriam's younger brother, a man who operated short-lived repair businesses out of a garage behind his house and owed more money than he earned. Hugo had plowed the parish parking lot some winters, patched gutters, hauled broken pews, and fixed locks without receipts whenever Miriam told the council he was cheaper than a contractor. He was not in town on Christmas Eve. Toll records and a casino hotel confirmed he was 3 counties away. That fact nearly protected Miriam until the detectives understood that she did not need Hugo present to use his name. For 5 years, she had been routing parish money into stale vendor accounts, reviving them on paper, signing approval slips as records custodian, and relying on Father Adrian's reluctance to expose the Mercy files because the same files contained his hidden family. The moral leverage was almost elegant in its cruelty. If he accused Miriam, she could reveal Willa, Pippa, and Miles. If he protected them, he had to sign reports he knew were not clean. For a while, perhaps, he told himself he was buying time. Men who live in divided rooms become experts in delayed courage. But the Christmas merger audit changed the arithmetic. The records would be moved. The accounts would be reconciled by outsiders. Father Adrian had decided to reveal his family and the theft together, not because it would save him, but because secrecy had stopped saving anyone else. The note on the back of Pippa's card was not sentimental. It was a plan. The harder question was what happened after midnight mass. The building itself answered in fragments. An altar server named Thomasin Dern, 12 years old at the time, told detectives months later that she had gone back through the side corridor for a forgotten mitten and heard voices in the record room. She had not mentioned it in December because she was supposed to have gone straight to her father's car and was afraid of being scolded. She remembered Father Adrian saying, "I have copied enough." She remembered Miriam saying, "They will not forgive you, and they will not forgive me. So don't pretend. This is mercy." Thomasin saw no one. She only remembered the voices because the corridor smelled strongly of hot wax and the church was otherwise quiet. A retired florist named Noreen Hask, who had decorated the side altar that evening, gave another small piece. She had parked behind the parish hall and left at 1:22 a.m. because her hip hurt and she wanted to avoid the departing crowd. She saw the light on in the record room and the cemetery gate closed, not open. At the time, that had meant nothing. Weeks later, when everyone talked about the gate swinging, June assumed she had remembered wrong. Now, with police asking again, she was ashamed of how easily official memory had edited her own. She also remembered Miriam's dark station wagon beside the receiving chapel lane, nose toward the cemetery, though Miriam had said she never left the office until after police arrived. The church phone records, thin as they were, offered a contradiction that could not be softened by memory. There had been no incoming call to the wall phone after 12:46 a.m. The call Miriam described at 1 never happened. There had been, however, an outgoing call at 1:36 a.m. to the police desk. Miriam had invented the emergency call because Father Adrian had not gone out to answer anyone. He had stayed inside, in the record room, with the woman who held the keys to his secret and the accounts he intended to expose. Ada and Royce reconstructed the likely movement slowly, not because the facts were theatrical, but because they were practical. A brass candlestick was missing from the record room inventory, one of 4 used on the credenza during Christmas week. The remaining 3 had been polished after the disappearance, though Miriam told police she had been too distraught to clean. A faint impact mark on the lower edge of the metal record cabinet, ignored during the first week because it seemed old, held a fleck of black enamel from Father Adrian's private phone case. The floorboards by the cabinet had been scrubbed with a lemon oil cleaner Miriam used in the office, but not in the sacristy. Under the baseboard, forensic technicians found a minute clot of blood and gray wool fibers, consistent with Father Adrian's coat. It was not enough to say how he died, but it was enough to say Miriam's office had not merely witnessed grief. The receiving chapel returned to the case through a ledger page so ordinary that the first investigators had photographed it and moved on. St. Audrin Cemetery used an old red binder to record temporary winter storage, vault openings, and maintenance access. On Christmas morning, an entry appeared at 2:10 a.m. for winter beer inspection, north receiving room. No remains present. Hinge check. It was signed with the initials of the cemetery caretaker, who swore he had been home asleep and had never written it. The ink matched Miriam's fountain pen. More importantly, the entry sat above an impression on the page made by writing that had been torn out from the sheet before it. Under a bleak light, the missing words emerged. A.L. mustn't be found in church. No one could prove Miriam wrote those words, but no one else had reason to tear away the page. The first search of the receiving chapel had been honest and insufficient. The caretaker had opened the front room. The officers had looked at the zinc table, the beers, the tent canvas, the chairs. They had not opened the rear ash closet because it had been plastered over years earlier after the parish stopped storing coal there. That was what the maintenance note in the cemetery binder said. But the plaster was newer than the wall around it. Behind stacked tent poles, detectives found a narrow seam painted with lime wash and dusted deliberately to look untouched. A mason opened it under floodlights while the June air pressed heavy against the cemetery. Ewes and news vans waited behind the iron fence. Inside was not a room in the way people imagine hidden rooms. It was a cold pocket between stone walls, barely wide enough to stand in, with old coal staining the bricks and a rusted vent near the ceiling. Father Adrian had been placed there in his coat, without his vestments, with his private phone broken beside him and a small paper bag of Christmas gifts still in his satchel. 2 chocolate oranges, a model airplane kit, and a silver hair clip wrapped in tissue. The discovery changed the town faster than the truth could explain itself. People who had cursed Fergus Taine in grocery lines began avoiding his eyes. Parishioners who had praised Miriam for her steadiness now spoke of her in whispers, then corrected themselves because whispering felt indecent. The diocese closed St. Audrins for a week and held mass in the school gym, where folding chairs squeaked on the floor and the altar looked temporary in a way that made everything feel exposed. Willa did not attend the first memorial. She sent Pippa and Miles to stay with her sister and spent the day with detectives, identifying the satchel by a split seam she had sewn herself. When Ada showed her the silver hair clip, still wrapped, Willa put both hands over her mouth and made no sound at all. Miriam was arrested 2 days after the body was recovered. She did not run. She was in the parish office, sorting envelopes for a food drive that would no longer be held there, when Ada and Royce came in. She looked at the warrants, then at the record cabinet, and for the first time since the case began, her posture lost its careful height. She asked whether they had told the children. Ada said their mother had. Miriam nodded, as if this were another administrative matter filed under sorrow. At the station, she declined to answer questions for 3 hours. Then, when shown the March family cards, she said Father Adrian had destroyed himself long before anyone touched him. She said he made hypocrites of everyone around him. She said she had protected the parish from scandal after scandal, while he played father in secret and pastor in public. Royce asked whether protection usually required fake burial fees. Miriam turned her face to the wall. The prosecution never got a full confession. What it got was better in court because it did not depend on remorse. It got records. It got the false phone call that never existed. It got the 8-second private call to Willa. It got Miriam's ink in the cemetery ledger, her handwriting on March family envelopes, her fingerprints inside the ash closet seam where the lime wash had flaked, and the financial path from parish charity accounts to Hugo Dace's dead companies. It got Noreen Hask's memory of the closed gate and the station wagon. It got Thomasin Dern's memory of voices in the corridor. It got the missing candlestick recovered from a municipal trash transfer load after a worker remembered a heavy brass church object in a black bag in late December, too damaged for clean DNA, but marked with the same polish Miriam had used on the others. It got the truth by accumulation, which is the least dramatic and most merciless way truth often comes. Fergus Taine sat through 2 days of preliminary hearings and left before anyone could apologize to him in a way that mattered. The town had made him useful as a container for its fear. He had been angry, drunk, grieving, rude, and wrong about many things. None of those things made him a murderer. Detective Stellan visited him in the small room he rented above the laundromat and told him the case against him would be formally closed. Fergus asked whether Father Adrian had suffered. Ada said the evidence suggested it was quick. It was not a promise she could fully prove, but it was a mercy close enough to fact that she allowed herself to give it. Fergus looked at the wall where his wife's photograph leaned against a coffee tin and said he was going to fix her stone. Ada had nothing to say to that. Some damage remained true even after the larger lie broke. The trial began the following spring, when tulips were coming up along the courthouse steps, and St. Audrins was still locked behind a chain-link fence for structural review. Miriam wore navy suits and no jewelry. She looked smaller away from the parish office, stripped of keys, registers, and the 1,000 small dependencies that had made people treat her control as service. Her defense tried to move blame back toward Father Adrian's secrecy. They said he had misused funds for a hidden household. They said Miriam had been overwhelmed by his demands. They said the investigation had turned a flawed priest into a martyr because death makes inconvenient men easier to love. There was enough truth in the first sentence to make the rest dangerous. Willa knew that. She walked to the witness stand with both children sitting behind her and refused to let the defense flatten their lives into scandal. She told the jury that Father Adrian had failed them in ways that were intimate and public at the same time. He had missed school plays. He had invented conferences to explain hospital visits. He had made Willa carry the burden of being loyal to a man who could bless other families at the front of a church while sitting at her kitchen table, like a guest who had to leave before morning. But he had also tried, late and imperfectly, to stop hiding. On the day before Christmas Eve, he had mailed her an envelope with copies of the records and a note saying, "The truth cannot be a gift if I keep wrapping it in fear." Willa read that line without crying. Miriam, at the defense table, closed her eyes. Pippa testified only to identify her father's handwriting on birthday cards. The judge allowed it because the defense had questioned whether the family relationship was being exaggerated to create sympathy. Pippa was 17 by then, all wrists and composure, with Father Adrian's solemn gaze and Willa's refusal to look away. She said he signed cards with the letter A because he was afraid even of ink. She said he called every Christmas after midnight mass and told them which hymn had gone badly because he thought making them laugh would make the distance smaller. That year, he had promised pancakes. She did not speak of doctrine, forgiveness, or betrayal. She spoke of waiting in a kitchen until dawn, listening to her mother call a number that kept failing. Miriam's financial scheme was dull on paper and devastating in meaning. Over 7 years, she had created small leaks no parish council member considered worth tracing. Duplicate candle orders, fictitious snow removal, emergency grave preparation for families who did not exist, reimbursements for funeral lunches never served, stipends redirected and then repaid in different accounts to hide timing. The amounts were rarely large enough to alarm anyone. Together, they had kept Hugo Dace's creditors quiet, paid Miriam's mortgage after her mother's medical debts, and allowed her to inhabit the role of the indispensable woman who sacrificed everything for the parish. Father Adrian had seen pieces. He had looked away because Miriam could expose Willa and the children. By the end, he had become part victim, part accomplice to silence, and wholly dangerous to the woman who understood records better than anyone. Ada testified for almost 5 hours. She described the case not as a thunderclap, but as a correction. The first report had moved police outward. Gate, Cemetery Lane, Mills, Fergus, darkness. The records moved them inward. Archive box, family cards, mercy files, false ledgers, receiving chapel. Every lie Miriam told had pointed away from a piece of paper she could not afford to have read in the right light. When the prosecutor asked what finally exposed the truth, Ada did not say the ash closet, the phone call, or the financial trail. She said, "The parish records placed Father Loxley inside a hidden life, and then showed who had been charging him rent for silence." The sentence settled over the courtroom with no flourish at all. Miriam did not testify. On the 8th day, after the jury had seen the photographs of the gray archival box and the scraped baptismal cards, she leaned toward her attorney and whispered for a long time. The plea came the next morning: guilty to manslaughter, tampering with evidence, theft from charitable funds, falsification of cemetery records, and obstruction. The murder count was withdrawn because intent could not be proven beyond every argument the defense could raise from the broken candlestick and the chaotic record room. Willa was angry about that until Ada explained that a plea would spare Pippa and Miles a second trial. Justice, like secrecy, sometimes arrived with terms no one would have chosen in a cleaner world. At sentencing, Miriam finally spoke. She did not ask forgiveness. She said Father Adrian had made St. Audrins fragile by asking ordinary people to carry extraordinary contradictions. She said she had spent her life keeping books straight for men who were praised for mercy, while women repaired the consequences. She said the money had begun as borrowing, and the silence had begun as kindness. The judge listened without expression. Then Willa stood. She did not defend Father Adrian's choices. She did not defend the church. She said only that Miriam had looked at 2 children, understood exactly what their father's disappearance would do to them, and used their hiddenness as a weapon even after he was dead. That, she said, was not the anger of an overburdened servant. It was the discipline of a person who believed other people became real only when entered in the records she controlled. Miriam was sentenced to 23 years. Hugo Dace, who had not known about the killing, but had knowingly accepted stolen parish funds, pleaded guilty to fraud and received a shorter sentence. The diocesan report, published months later, was careful, defensive, and incomplete in the way institutional reports often are. It acknowledged failures of oversight, misuse of restricted funds, inadequate record controls, and Father Adrian's violation of clerical obligations. It did not know how to write about Willa without making her sound like a problem, or about Pippa and Miles without making them sound like evidence. Willa refused to meet with the diocesan spokesman after the first attempt. She had spent enough of her life being spoken of in rooms where she was not present. St. Audrins never returned to what it had been, though buildings rarely admit that they have changed. The parish reopened in late autumn with new locks, new account procedures, and a lay records committee that required 2 signatures for access to sacramental files. The receiving chapel was cleaned, blessed, and left empty. Some parishioners wanted it demolished. Others wanted a plaque. Willa asked for neither. She asked that the March family cards be corrected and properly indexed, with no scraped lines, no euphemism, no masking tape category called pastoral household. The diocese resisted, then conceded after the prosecutor reminded them that the cards were court exhibits and already public. Pippa and Miles received certificates with their father's name spelled out in full. The paper did not heal them. It did stop pretending they had been a footnote. Fergus Taine's wife was reinterred in the correct family plot that December. The expired rites had been an error made worse by Miriam's refusal to reopen an old cemetery book while she was hiding worse things in newer ones. Fergus attended the brief service, sober, shaved, and visibly uncomfortable with kindness. He brought no speech. He touched the stone once and left before the parish council president could apologize in front of witnesses. Later, he sent Detective Stellan a Christmas card with no message, only his name and a pressed cedar sprig inside. Ada kept it in the case file for reasons that would not fit any evidence category. On the first anniversary of Father Adrian's disappearance, Willa drove Pippa and Miles to Larchmere after dark. They did not attend the public mass. They parked 2 streets below the church and walked up the hill after the crowd had gone. The limestone steps were wet with mist. The garden gate, repaired and newly painted, did not swing. Inside the church, the candles had been set straight, but not by Father Adrian. Pippa stood in the rear pew where Fergus had once stood. Miles looked at the sanctuary without the practiced reverence of a parish child and asked whether his father had been good. Willa took so long to answer that Ada, waiting near the side aisle to return a satchel the family had requested, thought she might not answer at all. "He was yours," Willa said finally. "He was many other things, but he was yours." They buried Father Adrian under his civil name as well as his priestly title, a compromise that satisfied no one completely and therefore seemed close to honest. Willa placed the silver hairclip in Pippa's hand rather than in the grave. Miles kept the model airplane kit, still unbuilt, because he wanted something his father had chosen before fear ended the choice. At the cemetery, the winter grass lay flat and pale around the stones. The old receiving chapel door was locked, but its key now hung in a new cabinet where 2 people had to sign it out. Records, Ada thought, could conceal almost anything when one person owned them. They could also return the dead to their names when enough people insisted on reading carefully. The story people told afterward became shorter because public memory prefers clean shapes. A priest disappeared after midnight mass. 6 months later, Parish records exposed his secret family. His records keeper had lied. A hidden body was found. A woman went to prison. Those sentences were true and insufficient. They left out Willa waiting by a dead phone, Pippa learning that shame could be inherited without consent, Miles holding a toy airplane from a father he could neither publicly mourn nor privately dismiss, Fergus Taine absorbing the town's suspicion because he was easier to suspect than a woman with keys and clean handwriting. They left out Father Adrian's cowardice, his tenderness, his late courage, and the fatal cost of postponing truth until it had to arrive all at once. Ada closed the file in January, though she knew no file like that ever closed cleanly. On the last page, she placed a photocopy of the corrected baptismal card, the one where the scraped line had been restored. Father, Adrian James Loxley. Beneath it, she placed Miriam's false cemetery entry and Willa's carrier record of the 8-second call. 3 records, 3 versions of a life. One tried to hide a family. One tried to hide a body. One preserved the moment between the two, when a man who had lived behind halfway doors finally ran out of hallway. Outside the station window, Larchmere's church bells began their noon pattern, not solemn, not triumphant, just accurate. For once, the sound did not make the town look upward. It made people look back at the papers, where the names had been waiting the whole time,